It's streaming. Check. Hey everybody, this is a 2025 market overview for those that are interested in what's going on with the real estate market in Longmont, Colorado. And specifically, this is for single family homes in 80503. So I put this presentation together just to give you an idea why some homes sold in 200 days last year in 2025, and some homes sold in 30 days. All right, so just to get started here, we start this presentation with just a focus on Colorado real estate market as a whole. And this graph here shows you the percent of list price versus sold price. So we can see that in 2020, 2021, 2022, we had pretty hot markets. So at this 100%, when the blue line is over this, it shows that the market's hot or buyers are competing with each other. So they're typically paying more than what the seller is asking for. Where this line drops off steeply is where interest rates were going up. That's because buyers were competing with each other in order to lock in interest rates before they went up. So around here, we're around the 3% interest rates. And then before the end of 2022, we were already up to 7%. So once we hit 7%, we drop down to this about 94% of asking price at the state level. And this next graph here just kind of gives you an idea of what's been going on with interest rates over the last couple of years. So this is from Freddie Mac, and Freddie Mac put together essentially what the starting interest rate is for buyers when they do their loan application. And this is important because oftentimes your final interest rate will change. That can be due to buying points or other sort of interest rates incentives. So I'll talk about that a little bit more later. Um, but what's important to look at here is in 2022, again, the interest rates went up dramatically, and they went up quickly with inflation. And then we hit almost a high of 8% towards the end of 2023. In 2024, there was some optimism about the Fed cutting interest rates, which the Fed, in fact, did cut the federal interest rates. They're related to, but not directly tied to mortgage rates. So actually, the biggest decline in interest rates was before the Fed cut, and that was because people had the anticipation of rates going down. Um, and then rates went up a little bit because there were some expectations that inflation might rebound. They stayed a little bit elevated until we got into April of 2025. Then we had our kind of the Liberation Day when the tariffs were announced. Rates jumped a little bit, and then they eventually started their gradual decline until where we're at right now. So right now, the interest rates are about 6%, and that's about a 3-year low. So if you bought a home and you're in the 7% or higher, it probably does make sense to refinance. Um, Freddie Mac, they put together this initial interest rate because, again, it shows what buyers were at before any points or buy downs. This is for buyers who have over a 760 credit score and 20% down. So, in other words, kind of your perfect buyer. Higher interest rates mean that the same priced home in 2025 compared to 2021 has a payment that's essentially double. But there are some other headwinds that have caused our market to slow down a little bit. So let's talk about that. This is a graph I put together that just shows what the payments would look like for a $750,000 home in 80503. So if you're buying a home at $750,000 today at 6%, your interest in principal payments is going to be about $3,560. Sometimes it's possible for buyers to lower their interest rates through points. And points essentially means that you're paying 1% of the loan amount. So in this case, if we're buying a home for $750,000 and putting down 20%, we have a loan amount of $600,000. So 1% of that is going to be $6,000. So you spend $6,000 and it will typically reduce your interest rate somewhere between 0.25% to 1.25%, so 1/8 of a point. A reduction in 0.25% is obviously the best case scenario. The exact cost of a point can vary a little bit, just like interest rates. So if I go back a slide, um, the interest rate that you lock in, you don't lock in until the day that you go under contract, and they can vary day by day. So the same is true with points. The cost of the point and how much it's going to impact your interest rate can change a little bit day by day. But on average, 1% of the loan amount will reduce your interest rate by 0.25%. So that 0.25% reduction, again, for this perfect buyer with a 760 credit score and 20% down, is going to lower your interest rate in this case about $95 or make your payment about 2.66% more affordable. And by the way that you determine whether or not points make sense to purchase or not is you do a little bit of simple math to see if or how long it's going to take you to recover that expense. So in this case, if we're at 6% today and you buy 1 point and it takes you down to 5.75, it's going to cost you $6,000, let's say. It saves you about $95 a month. So it's going to take you about 5.2 years in order for this to make sense. If you're not planning on being in the home for that long, it probably doesn't make sense to buy points. Um, and there are other ways to reduce your interest rate that are less expensive, but they typically have the impact of reducing your total payment more, but for a shorter period of time, versus in this case, a point lasts as long as you have the loan. Another thing besides interest rates that has made housing more expensive is the fact that insurance has essentially become a national crisis. So this graph comes from the Federal Research and Economic Data Center, and it shows you the cost of insurance as a monthly expense since 2016 to 2025. So you can see here in 2023, as interest rates started, or sorry, as inflation started to approach the 10% level, insurance started to increase as a monthly expense as well. So, in fact, Colorado has been one of the hardest hit states in the country in terms of insurance increases. A lot of people think about the insurance crisis going on in Florida, but according to the National Bureau of Economic Research, Colorado has seen the highest levels of insurance premium increases. Between, what is it? There was about a 137% increase from an average premium of $1,745 a year to $4,142. That's for the entire state of Colorado. Let me zoom in a little bit so you can see this. And now the average insurance premium in Boulder County is typically over $5,000 a year. But it's not just insurance that's gone up. Taxes have gone up as well. So property taxes between 2023 and 2024 went up about 34% in Boulder County. And taxes are assessed every odd year. So they were last assessed in 2023. They'll be reassessed again this year in 2025. The state and local governments have been battling over what is the best way to reduce property taxes, but in many cases, they have still been going up. And this is primarily because there is a cap at the state level for how much revenue can be generated by the county from property taxes, and it caps the increase on how much the county can increase property taxes. But it's not just the county that has their hands involved with property taxes. There's other things like conservation easements, school districts, fire districts, and they add on to your property tax through something called a mill levy. In any case, property taxes have gone up as well, which increases buyers' payments and their ability to qualify. So the combined impact between insurance and property taxes looks something like this. For the average single-family home in Longmont, let's say the taxes in 2023 may have been $3,384. And then in 2024, they may have looked something like 4,530. That's a 33.88% increase. And insurance likely went from something like $3,333 to $5,000, or a 50% increase. So the impact is that to buy that $750,000 home in 2023, your all-in payment, principal and interest, taxes and insurance may have looked something like $3,907. And then in 2024, it would look like $4,391. That's about the equivalent of having raised interest rates 1.25%. Or as we've seen in some of our previous examples with the points, that's the same as making housing about 13.56% less affordable. So, in light of that, it's amazing really how resilient the Boulder County real estate market has been compared to other parts of the country which are undergoing more significant housing price corrections. The percentage of median list price to sold price in Boulder County, essentially, we can see follows kind of a similar level as the state, where it caps at 104.5% during the COVID years, especially in the lead up to 2022 when buyers were trying to lock in low interest rates before they went up. And then after that, interest rates, let me see if I can zoom in a little bit for you. And then after that, the percentage of asking price to sold price kind of hits a floor here of 96%. So far, we haven't really gone under that very much. But the price that sellers are getting in relation to what they're originally asking is starting to get less and less. So in this case, we're starting to kind of see us floating more around the 98% of asking price mark. This graph here shows, oops. This graph here shows the median sales price. So we can see it's relatively stable. Here we're kind of flatlined here. One of the things that's important to keep in mind about these graphs versus the median percentage of original list price versus sales price is the fact that this doesn't count for concessions. So when sellers agree to pay extra closing costs for the buyers, and the buyers are typically asking for those extra closing costs so that they have money to either buy down interest rates or reduce their overall payment. So later, as we kind of get into some more data that I've broken down specifically for 80503, I'm going to show you kind of how that impacts these graphs. So here's kind of the same graph, percentage of sold price versus median price. And this compares Longmont in the blue line and 80503 in the red line. You can see we're pretty closely tracking each other. Generally, we've outperformed Boulder County by a little bit, with 80503 falling slightly behind. And this makes a lot of sense because the main question in real estate right now is a question of affordability. So 80503 tends to be a little bit more expensive than the rest of Longmont. So things tend to be slightly less affordable. And that's where you see the lag. But it's important to note, I think, that the difference between these is essentially less than 1%. So overall, Longmont and 80503 are performing well and perhaps performing the best in Boulder County. But when we look at concessions and how this affects what the sellers are putting in their pocket at the end of the day, I broke down some data and I found that in 2025, there was about 350 single family homes that sold. Out of those 350, about 50% of those sellers had to pay some money to the buyers in order to reduce their closing costs and interest rates. So if you look at who paid that, the bottom 25th percentile, this includes a lot of sellers that paid nothing, by the way, in terms of concessions towards the buyers. But for those bottom 25th percentile, they paid on average $1,359. Around the 50th percentile, they paid $6,202. And then on the 75th percentile, these sellers were on average paying around $12,000. But there were some sellers that paid as much as $30,000 towards buyers' interest rate buydowns. And if you're getting a conforming loan, a loan that's backed by the federal government, there are limits to how much the seller is able to contribute towards the buyer's closing costs. So in some cases, in the 75th percentile, there were many sellers who maxed out on how much they were legally able to contribute towards the buyer's closing costs. Um, so I wanted to kind of figure out why this is happening and specifically, how do we avoid being in this 75th percentile of homes? So I put together some data and let's see, I'm going to get a highlighter out. So what this data shows for the 350 sales that we had in NADA 503, again, this is talking about a single family, what was the average time that these homes spent on the market and what were they priced at in terms of dollars per square foot? Because I ran various regression analysis to try to figure out what was the most important factor in a seller getting nearly 100% of asking price and giving the least amount of concessions. And the strongest indicator was how well the home was priced to begin with. So for those homes at price that were listed between $200 to $600 a square foot, this kind of makes one category, specifically homes priced between $200 to $600 a square foot, which sold less in less than 100 days. Then there was another group of sellers that priced the same or whose property sold for the same amount of dollars per square foot between 200 to 600, except for these homes sold in more than 100 days. There's typically a third group of properties here, and those are homes that were priced between $600 to $1,000 a square foot. So I'm going to go through each one of these different groups to see what information we can learn. So the first group that we looked at was the homes that took longer than 100 days to sell. And this is important because homes that sell relatively quickly for our market are about 33% more likely to sell close to 100% of asking price and pay the buyers less in terms of concessions. But for the homes that sit on the market for longer than 100 days, this tends to mean that the sellers are going to sit way longer on the market than their peers. So they're going to sit on the market for typically between 173 days to 200, and that's the mean, not even the average. These sellers are also selling for less. So while our average sits around at 98% of asking price, these sellers are typically selling for about 5% less than asking price. They represent some of the steepest concessions. The concession amount that they are paying as a median is around $12,000, which is far higher. So in general, this is kind of the area that we don't want to be in. We want to price a home in such a way that it's going to sell within or go under contract within 100 days. After that, we start to get into a danger zone, and it typically means that the seller is not positioning themselves to walk away with the most amount of money. The one exception to the rule was for the homes that are priced with like a mean price point of around $1.3 million, these were tending to take a little bit longer. Then the homes that are priced over $600 a square foot, or so more specifically between 600 to $1,000 a square foot, these homes tended to be in the top 10% of homes in terms of value. They have a median list price of 2.24 million. They're larger homes at 4,410 square feet. These homes typically sell in less than 100 days. I said here it's about a 50% chance, and um, you can see that there's some homes that sell in 50 in less than 100 days, and there's some that sell a little bit longer. So it's kind of an even distribution here. Um, the concessions to buyers, however, tends to be significantly less than their fairly cheaper in terms of dollars per square foot peers. And the reason for that is that these buyers tend to be much less interest rate sensitive. These aren't buyers that are putting down 20%. They're often buyers that are purchasing with a significant down payment of over 50% or cash. So the interest rates are a little bit less of an affordability factor for these buyers. Interestingly, there were very few ranches that sold in 80503 in 2025. There tends to be less ranches available generally because ranches are more expensive to build. And the reason for that is that you have bigger roof lines, bigger foundations, and they take up more space. So land is expensive in Colorado, and foundations and roof lines are some of the most expensive elements in the home to engineer and to construct. So you tend to see less and less ranches. Um, but still, they're the majority of the ranches in 2025 happen to fall into this category. Almost every single home that was in this price point had at least one main level primary bedroom with a primary bathroom. So not to say that that was the only primary. In some cases, they had a secondary suite located on a second level. Um, but on almost every case, there was at least one main level bedroom and primary on the main. So if we go to that $200 to $400 per square foot section of homes that sold in less than 100 days, then I kind of wanted to look at those to see what lessons, we could take away from them. So the sweet spot tends to be around or a little bit less than $400 a square foot, specifically between $300 to $400 a square foot. Um, I also looked into some other things besides pricing to see if I could find something else that was making these homes sell faster. One of the things I specifically looked into was ranch style homes. Ranch style homes was something I wanted to look into because typically we have a greater demand for ranch style homes, and as I just talked about, it's not the most common style of home to build just because they're more expensive. So like builders, new construction, for example, they're more excited to build two-story homes because it's cheaper to build and they can fit more of them within a subdivision. Um, that being the case, there oftentimes the people that are wanting to purchase ranch style homes are an older demographic. And this year, it's very possible that some of the demographic that already owns a home and would have planned to sell that home in order to buy a ranch may have decided to put the move off because they get this senior exemption reduction in their taxes. It's about a 50% discount. So if you're over 60 and you've lived in your home for more than 10 years, you qualify for this senior exemption discount. And some of them may have not wanted to give up both a 3% mortgage and their senior exemption discount. So they're more locked into this housing freeze than their other peers that have the 3% interest rates. The other biggest factor impacting price was bathrooms. So it has a strong correlation to price, but only in a very specific scenario. So if you're comparing a home that has one bathroom to two bathrooms, there was about $134,000 difference for that extra additional bathroom. That being said, after two bathrooms, the correlation factor is almost statistically insignificant. And the same can be said with bedrooms going from two bedrooms to three bedrooms. But I think the reason for this is that the total square footage of the home kind of encompasses bathrooms um, and bedrooms. So the larger your home gets, it's kind of expected that you're going to have more bedrooms and more bathrooms, right? Age was also a slightly important factor in terms of price and speed to sale, but it was relatively minor. And that's to be somewhat expected because 80503, the majority of the housing stock um, is not new construction, right? Most of it has been around for several decades at this point, 60s, 70s, 80s. When we look at this data, and this data that I put together is adjusted for the percentage of asking price, considering concessions as well. So this information is not very easy to find. Um, I put together two graphs here. One is the average days to offer, so how long it takes for that home to go under contract, and this is by month. We can see here, let me just, we can see here again that one of the better months to sell usually starts between March and it goes to September. Once we get into September, we enter into a seasonal market, and it takes longer for homes to sell just because there's not as many buyers that are out there. This can be in most years, not this year, but in most years related to weather and also school cycles because many people have kids in schools and they don't find it to be the optimal time to be moving. If we look at what's the best time of year to sell in terms of sold to list price, then there's only 1 month in 2025 where homes were consistently selling over asking price, and that was in February. Sometimes what happens is we get so little inventory available in the wintertime, and this year we had a positive movement in interest rates. So the interest rates brought more buyers into the market than there otherwise would have been, but there were so few homes available that prices actually did very well in 80503 and in February. As we moved into March and April, that those were the next best months out of the year. And then by that point in time, things started to go down a little bit. Sellers started to get a little bit less than they were asking for when you factored in concessions. This reached zenith, I guess, if you will, in July. This is typically the best time of year to buy a home because you have the most amount of homes for sale. And it's also part of the reason why sellers are consistently getting the least amount um, in terms of sold price versus list price for their homes. And that's essentially the buyers have more options to choose from. In today's market, they can take their time, and sellers are competing with each other, especially at this point, because you don't have much more time to go before you hit the fall market. Days on market starts to go up and prices start to slide again. So July is the best time for buyers. If you're a seller, I would say March and April or February. Like this year, I think February is going to be a great month. So I'm going to talk in the next few slides, just kind of my recommendations for 2026 and some predictions that I have. But before I get to that, I just wanted to give a little bit of context to something. I looked at 350 single family homes that have sold, and I tried to find the patterns that made those sales successful. But the untold story here is that there was over 220 homes that were taken off the market or didn't sell. That's a lot of homes. And we can see that even though prices have been relatively stable, albeit concessions have been going up somewhat, each year we get slightly more and more homes for sale in 80503. What happens is some of these sellers list their homes for sale. They don't get the result that they want. And then after a month, they take their home off the market. Some of these sellers decide to wait until the next year when there's some anticipation that interest rates will be better. These are sellers that are probably motivated, more motivated the next time that they give it a go. They have photos taken. They may be doing improvements to get their home even more marketable. And this is kind of shadow inventory usually refers to, you know, potential for foreclosures and bank sales, but this is like a group of sellers that could join the market at any point in time. And the number is pretty massive because if we look at that 220 homes that were taken off the market, as of January right now, we're close to 90 homes for sale total. So the the amount of homes on the market could increase dramatically at any second. So when we're talking about 2026, I think it's going to be a pretty good year. I would expect that if interest rates continue to decline, there could be appreciation somewhere in the range of like 1 to 2%. Concessions might start to ease as well as interest rates go down and payments become more affordable. But I don't expect any major changes. If there's a lot of returning inventory that comes back on the market, it's more than likely that prices could even stay the same or potentially even slide a little bit further, maybe another 1 to 2% or so. One of the things that really helps Boulder County's real estate market stay fairly stable is that 70% of our land is non-developable. So whether that's open space or conservation easements, that limits the opportunity for builders to come in, and we don't tend to get overbuilt like some other markets in kind of more historically boom and bust markets like Idaho, Arizona, Florida. So what other things could derail the market this year? One of the things would be interest rate trajectory. As we saw on the previous charts, there have been a few false starts, if you want to call it, for declining interest rates. There is a lot of enthusiasm again, just like there was in August, September of 2024, that interest rates were going to decline. If for some reason that doesn't pan out, and interest rates stay somewhat stable or even rise again, that could cool down the market. As a seller, I think you're better to not try to time the trough in interest rates, but be ahead of it while the market is optimistic that they're coming. Because when buyers think interest rates are going to go down, they typically try to get into the market with the belief that when the rates do go down, things will get more competitive. And that is typically true. When the interest rates do go down, the market does get more competitive. But as we've seen, it doesn't always play out, and it's really difficult to time the interest rates because they change daily, and any number of news cycles can alter interest rates. So trying to get your home listed on the exact day that the interest rates are the lowest and having a buyer who's ready to go is tough. Because this graph here shows the months of supply. So the months of supply essentially indicates how long it would take you to sell the home if no new homes became available. And we can see 1 here means it'll take about 1 month to go under contract. 2 means it'll take 2 months. So it the months of supply has been increasing somewhat, but on average, for all price points across 80503 at this point in time right now, it'd take about 2.5 months to get a buyer if your home is priced correctly. So I think you're better to start early um, in the year. And I'll talk a little bit more about some suggestions as I get to the next slide. But other things that could possibly derail the market, a lot of buyers, especially for upper end homes, are funding parts of down payment through sales of stocks, whether that's coming through brokerage accounts or 401ks, IRAs. If there was some type of AI bubble in the market, that could potentially derail things a little bit. Wars, obviously, inflation rebound. We kind of talked about that, but maybe like one specific scenario that could cause interest rates to go up is kind of this bond market and the Fed tension right now. So recently, the Federal Reserve chairman was served with a subpoena. If the market believes that the Federal Reserve is acting politically, right, By reducing interest rates, the bond market might get nervous. At the same time, the Federal Reserve might now have some pressure to not change interest rates, especially in light of some fairly positive job reports, in an effort to appear apolitical. So, you know, lower interest rates are not a foregone conclusion at this period of time. So some suggestions for 2026 to home sellers. Interest rates are at a 3-year low right now. I've seen in the marketplace, like at 5%, the market is actually, I think, doing pretty good. 6% is fairly, the market seems to tolerate it to some extent. When you start to get into the high sixes or sevens, that's where things kind of seem to fall apart a little bit. So we're in the best position that we've been in for a while right now with interest rates at almost 6%. So I think listing early, especially before any potential competition can get on the market, sets you apart. Um, I'd try to price correctly as much as possible because for the most part, buyers do not like the idea of hardball tactic negotiating with sellers. Buyers have time right now, in many cases, 2 to 3 months to look at homes, and they use that time to compare different properties that are for sale. They don't feel the need to jump immediately. So, since buyers have that time, they know a good price when they see a good price, and they also know a high price. So, of course, there's always going to be those buyers out there who want to lowball you, but I think putting yourself in a position where you sit on the market for 3 months with no activity and then reducing the purchase price puts a target on your back from that group of buyers versus trying to target the buyers who are really serious about buying a home. They just don't want to pay too much in this market. So pricing correctly, that's been proven for 2025. That's a number one correlating factor to a successful and a speedy sale. If you're trying to sell your home and you need to buy a replacement property, then there's some things that you might consider. So one of them is if you're listing in March or April, say it takes you about 2 months in order to sell the home. And by the way, the data for the majority of those homes that sold quickly and close to asking price were selling in less than that. But if it takes you about 2 months, March or May gives you time, say March, the entire month of March, entire month of April. Say it takes to go under contract, and then it takes 30 days to close. So you are under contract for the month of June, and then you close July 1st. Well, that's probably the perfect scenario because you're getting the best price the market will bear in those early months out of the year, in those spring months. But by the time that you get to July, you have the pick of the litter. There's going to be the most homes available at any point during the year. And statistically, as a buyer in that capacity, you're going to have the best chance of negotiating the lowest price. So if you're selling and buying, that's kind of a timeline that I would consider. And in the meantime, I would try to get the home as turnkey as possible. It's kind of interesting because when the interest rates were 3%, buyers really didn't want project homes because they could just get a higher loan to buy a nicer home, right? And it made sense because the interest rates were only 3%. So you pay an extra $100,000 for the home and it didn't have a huge impact on your payment. But it did make a difference for the buyer because they didn't have to spend a ton of extra money out of pocket getting the home to be just the way they wanted it to be. Well, now with higher interest rates, buyers are pretty stretched, right? So in 2023, a buyer would have had to make $95,000 if they were putting 20% down, had perfect credit, um, and no debt to buy a home. Then in 2024, they had to make almost 15% more than that. Again, if they were putting 20% down, had perfect credit and no debt. Most buyers do have some debt, and most buyers are, especially first-time home buyers, are putting something down like 10%. This means that in reality, those payments are even more exaggerated than probably this presentation might lead one to believe. So the bottom line is there's not tons of excess cash available for some of these buyers. So you want to have make your home look as turnkey as possible so that buyers don't get scared away by potential projects. A good way to manage this is to get a pre-inspection. So like when I'm working with my clients in advance, we'll typically get a pre-inspection on the home. The pre-inspection allows us the opportunity to locate any things that might come up on the buyer's inspection. Some of those things would be a return on investment for us to do in advance, and allow us to get a little bit more money for the home versus when we're under contract, it might just be something that we end up needing to do to get the sale across the finish line. Painting oftentimes makes the home look way newer and again, more turnkey. There's some little things that people can do, like changing gold finishes. So gold is kind of coming back right now, but there are some things like handle knobs people still tend to think makes the home look pretty dated. Those are easy things for most homeowners to change. All you need is a screwdriver. Um, so there's some little things that you could either do or have a handyman do for you, which will make the home look much more modern. Of course, cleaning and decluttering, those are some of the biggest returns on investment. Um, and staging, it can be expensive, so it's not always worth it in every circumstance. But in some cases, it is worth it. And that's when you have a really clunky layout, right? Staging can kind of distract it from the layout or give the buyers an idea of how to use the space. It can also help when there are some defects that you don't necessarily want to cover up, but distract from, right? Just because staging can kind of bring in some different elements, even of a dated home, and kind of bring it into a modern feel and distract from some of those things at the same time. So, if you have any questions on staging, I'm happy to talk to you about that and whether it makes sense. So finally, I just put some of my credentials on here. I think one thing that sets me apart from other agents is that I do care about your financial well-being, and it doesn't matter to me if your home is your biggest investment in your life or just one of your many investments. I know that you worked hard for your money, and I owe you honesty, and I'm committed to giving you that. So I want you to know that I will work as hard to preserve your investment as you worked to buy it in the first place. So we always have a guarantee with our company that if you're unhappy with our services, you can cancel our listing agreement at any time. And if you have any questions, you're always welcome to reach out to me. I have a QR code on here. One is for a Facebook group for Hello 80503. This is where I'll post recordings of these videos as well as some other local contractors and businesses. And if you want to schedule a meeting with me, whether it's about any questions about selling your home or what's going on with the marketplace, I'd be happy to answer those questions for you. No pressure, any expectations that you are going to sell, that you're going to use me, but I would love to be a resource. So thank you so much, and we'll see you soon.